Hello everyone, today we talk about the Indian war elephant between roughly the 4th and 2nd century BC. We'll stick essentially to Indian warfare per se. Of course, Indian war elephants were used also in the West, famously enough. However, we'll stick to the, to the Indian context, right? We already made some video about Mauryan warfare and we'll expand on it. And we already addressed something about elephant warfare per se. I think I made something about the forest elephant, small forest elephant, for its employment in the Mediterranean. So we'll keep also making videos on how elephants were employed concretely on the field. This is just like a presentation of what could these Indian war elephants look like and were manned with and crewed with, and also what was the employment from the basing ourselves on the equipment, fundamentally on the armament, which is important not to be even for granted. Elephants were an essential part of Indian armies already by the 6th century BC, after which they are documented by Greek authors, stressing how already consistent elephant employment was. Essentially, the elephants in India supplanted what was essentially chariot warfare, a bit like around the first millennium BC. We're not terribly documented, but we know that more or less it happened. Not very differently what happened with horsemen in the West. We're making a video just recently about that, the rise of cavalries during the Iron Age. What is interesting is that chariot warfare will continue in the Indian subcontinent up to the early Middle Ages, which is fascinating and speaks essentially of an aristocratic, oligarchic character of Indian politics and society. This same employment of horsemanship, saying horsemanship was, let's say, more developed in Indian armies than we think. In parallel at this point still to elephant warfare and chariot warfare, they more or less equated each other, right? And simply Indian rulers had lots of elephants, of course, available, and in spite of the problems that, of course, the cons that elephant warfare has is to be observed also in Western battlefields at some level, there was actually a functional employment of the same. Let's say that there are certain things that died out with time in the West, so for which we say, okay, well, they weren't really useful, right? They were just some kind of Orientalist fancy that was used also for ideological reasons. I myself often described like a bit how Indian-Hellenistic warfare, for example, the use of chariots, but the same elephants, right, was associated to kind of an ideal of sophistication. If you want to have a theoretical, let's say, employment of all this that had to appear in ecumenic sense, like all the forces of the world, right, drawn from all the various continents. In this, we think about the Seleucid army that was the most multicultural in nature, if you want. It was a hell of an army. And so as Westerners, we want to say, okay, well, since these things, think about even during the Punic Wars, the elephants, eventually the Romans won anyway. Of course they did. It's not the elephants would change, would be decisive per se in any context, but let's observe, as described, in fact, on elephant warfare already, that the Romans also kept using elephants in their own armies, basically on all the fronts. They fought throughout basically all the 2nd century BC, or at least I think the last times. Well, okay, yes, it happened also during the civil wars, but because in Africa they were levying Numidian troops at that point. But let's say the linear employment from the Macedonian wars onwards to, I think, the Numantine war is quite evident there, always actually because of the Numidian allies, but meaningfully enough, because again, if something works on the field, you use it. If it's something more, if you can, there are say elephants are not just about the military employment, they have also logistical capacity. So that's why also we find in Indian warfare sometimes very large numbers, and we say that's an exaggeration. So how many? I don't know. The Maori feel, I don't know, 9,000 elephants. That's an exaggeration. Well, leaving aside, of course, the unscientificity of certain quantities that have always to be read in context, that sometimes they're just like figures, wanting to give an idea of the scale and of the magnitude of a certain army. But let's consider also the logistical employment, and especially in India, right? Because in the West, I'm not aware of any, or at least it was contingential to certain other situations. Elephants could be used, even during the Middle Ages, to tear down enemy fortifications, things like that. So, of course, we don't see all, and we don't know all that we would like about these times. It's just that, let's say, where something is effective and it costs, a reason, it's good enough in general. Well, this will get being employed, and if it, in the Indian case, in terms of elephant warfare, definitely shows that was in fact the reality of the situation. Not just, of course, the Indians were kind of more functionalized. The Indian armies were more functional to elephant employment in a sense, but evidently this arm had an importance. Then there is the contact with the West. Also, think about the Battle of the Daspes, where definitely the elephants were not, particularly impacting. There were problems there. Many of them got wounded immediately. They got confused, etc. But also we weren't there. And again, generally speaking, what is used in such a regular way is because it works by one degree or another, and it's not a matter of tactical formula. Let's say the phalanx versus, I don't know, the Indian arrays. That is quite a discriminant there. It's in fact the background, right? The political will, the moral force, the collective training, the statal structures behind it could provide the discipline and things. And these are just means, as we see them, in fact. And consider, by the way, that, as always, certain cultures develop military systems because they fight within it, right? So in India, everybody fought like that among each other, and so this warfare was functional to mostly that specific context, of course. But symmetry, the asymmetry in this context, especially in the ancient world, is always very low between a culture and another. Right. And speaking of the elephants proper, it seems that the older ones were the most prized, right, for battle, because of their experience. So not very differently from humans. Elephants grow in age in different ways. Like the 60 years old apparently were the most prized, which probably made them relatively few, and part of the reason why they were so appreciated, because the normal lifespan of an elephant is between 60 and 80 years old. And as we know, elephants are particularly intelligent animals, such as horses, dolphins, etc. So in warfare, they do a lot, frankly, also in an autonomous way, and they're very aggressive if brought to be so, because normally the elephant is, for the rest, kind of a docile beast. But of course, it was a functionalization as much as it existed for the horses, frankly, because not all animals behave in the same way, and generally speaking, they don't do things that tend to harm them, right? But the most testosterone-loaded horses, for example, do strange things, such as crashing themselves in their bones through fences. We know alone, right? Whereas other horses are kind of more timid. They even don't like quite to charge, or they I don't know. They want to step over corpses or things like that. So there is a selection there as well, and I presume for the elephants was the same. Even if their employment was different from one of the horses, that elephants. We know it from the West. The way they charge is actually about just the fact of themselves moving and having this dramatic mass that moves. In fact, there are lines, there are rows, fundamentally, actually, of elephants, and they are actually all males except the leader that in the front, that is a female in heat. And that's how you actually make the elephant row go on. Literally, that's it. So even if you see at Zama how the Romans countered that, the Carthaginian elephant charge, in that sense, that the linearity of the charge is important. But there was also a contained number of elephants. In Indian warfare, it was quite not. It would go on famously enough up to the 18th century, right? So there wasn't really anything up to the greatest refinement of and spread, frankly, of firearms, of guns that would take them out of the battlefields. And elephants were protected, of course, from tar, because they are enormous and therefore very easy targets by missile. And however, they are not, as you know, just their skin is very thick. The only way you actually can take them out effectively is literally to spear them in the butt, literally, because that's the only soft part. And for this reason, even in the West, you see there's evidence of, as we'll see now, of an escort that had to protect the elephant, preventing this to happen. So much that elephants, in this sense, weren't quite there alone all the time. Infantry always surrounded them in a sense, plus, the crew that that stayed on top and defended them in the same way. So elephants had a cloth caparison that in India is called attatara, right? That was often heavily embroidered. Otherwise, they could have real padded coverings, the paristara, right, which gave a more secure seat for the crew, right, as basically was secured with straps or rows of ropes, and this could be hanged at the same covering, which naturally provided protection for the elephant. We know that padded coverings can do miracles, right, especially against missile. Like if you consider all the stuff that can fly, can land on you in a battle, think ancient warfare is something. Yet there are these lines fighting, and the sky is crossed constantly by everything. You can imagine javelins, arrows, stones, and so on. So most of the hits that, will, given, the fact that they have lost power in part, in order that they don't come actually straight perpendicular to the surface, etc., can easily be stopped by padded coverings, right? And plus the elephant, as we've seen, has a very good natural protection by itself. So it was like an attritional thing, it was to wear the elephants out, literally attacking them, making, wounding them, making them bleed out of so many different hits, and it was hard to do, also because the elephant was dangerous enough from the front. The elephant riders had so these ropes that allowed them essentially to remain on board during all the things that you could imagine could happen in a battlefield, and also including the same elephants fundamentally freaking out. And so the obvious thing was essentially not falling from the elephant ruinously, because they're fairly tall, and if you fall in, it's already a dangerous situation if you fall from them, and if you break some bone, it's definitely not like a good experience to find yourself in. And naturally, this ensured properly the same stability needed to also use weapons, practically, and all the muscular force that can unbalance you in some way. There wasn't really a platform in this sense, so you had literally being on the back of the elephant that is definitely not flat. So that was important, remaining tied in some way. But of course, just for horsemanship, the fact that other cultures didn't have saddles or stirrups, especially as are not around, but would compensate with a quite athletic body fundamentally, mostly thighs, muscles, and to remain properly safely standing. And naturally, standing on an elephant, I presume a horse is more challenging, but you can adapt more easily in a way. Elephants really present you with, just for the size, with some problems that you can't really adapt to just as a human body, if not just hoping to remain up, staying in positions that are not particularly good for fighting back against those who are attacking the elephant. So it's a bit of a different thing. In any case, there was a sort of athleticism connected, as we will see now, to probably the idea of elephant riding that was very similar to the equestrian one in many cultures, because simply what could be a horseman somewhere else, and as we've seen actually in India, there was a lot of horsemanship. This is underappreciated in my opinion, just because of the oligarchic Indo-Aryan cultural background of especially the aristocracy, etc. But riding an elephant was kind of like riding a horse. Like we find even single warriors riding an elephant, which is frankly interesting, because it's like you dominate a much larger beast in a way. And so they were exalted by this idea in a way or another. And I remember that the reference to in-mounted elephant riding are present in very old works, such as most famously the Mahabharata, but not only that, are quite old texts. Like they are a bit like our Iliad in proportion, and so they speak also of times where heroic ideals were much more deeply rooted and obstinate than later on, where, however, in Indian warfare remained somewhat less, in fact, rationalized, less developed also than in the West. So that's important to consider culturally as well. The writers say that there were also bells hung on the neck rope and elsewhere, I presume to increase the psychological effect, but also probably for pointing out the fact that these were signaling that they were on the move. I don't know whether, I think it's mostly a matter of for scaring the enemy. Think about all the elephants with all the sounds all together, but it may be also something is moving down here, down there. Probably they were mostly hanging in the front, so where the elephants would have also been attacked. So that might have been just acoustically a signal to make to see whether there was some attack from the front suddenly or something like that. You could maybe from the top of the elephant realize it better. I don't know, just my guess. The harness could be decorated with gold as well. So as we've seen, it's not very different from the role that a chariot in itself could have, right? Of course, an elephant costed dramatically more than a horse, and even at a chariot by itself, I presume, especially on the long run, and logistically, etc. So these elephants were loaded with specific meanings, right? The Indian warfare Indian culture was still loaded, would remain for a long time. This kind of intrinsic, non-critically or rationalistically thought kind of categories of what an elephant is in absolute term, in abstract term, but it's that elephant, right? And it belongs to somebody, and that somebody is powerful if he has a lot of elephants, and if he can decorate their harness with something like gold, right? So that's particularly important. One of the late books of the Mahabharata mentions elephant armor made of oxhide and serpent skin, while a chronicle mentions a king of Ceylon in the 2nd century BC, whose elephant had a 7-fold armor of buffalo hide, which is a hell of a protection if you think about that. 7 layers of buffalo hide. It's not just a few, right? And yes, there aren't, in terms of physical, muscular force. Yes, if another elephant charged into, the belly of the other, could definitely, especially consider that the tusks were reinforced with metal, very pointy. So that was not just for taking out other fighters, but the same elephants. So that could, if launched at a certain speed, could make devastating damage to the elephant body, in spite of buffalo hide. But it was still enough, right? Again, even here for preparing most of the hits, presumably. And this was a king's elephant in Ceylon, by the way. So that the southern, Ceylon in the as an island but properly the south of India was kind of wilder. But that tells you by how spread this kind of elephant warfare concretely was in South Asia altogether. And how we don't have to think, because you see there is the idea the Indo-Europeans invaded India, and so there was the ethnic debate about that. But in terms of more strictly political, military, and cultural issues, right? The idea is that the Indo-Europeans, yes, conquered and began to rule mostly from Vedic time, from the more developed areas of the north, right? So the Indus, the Ganges rivers, and so on. But paradoxically, those were areas that, being more populated, etc., had could in fact influence the same conquerors more. So paradoxically, in other outskirts, even in the north, but in the south, it was more even areas that had maybe less penetrated ethnically by Indo-Europeans, still absorbed culturally for those communities were kind of more tribal in nature, that all their ethos, right, of free warriors, of this also oligarchic and kind of privatistic idea of who is the clan leader and the power, etc. So we find often this this mindset, a very aggressive one, by the way, as Indian history shows us some of the most radically ferocious blood. It's kind of cute how the Westerners in the 70s got obsessed with Orientalist delusions that have nothing to do with Asian history and religions in the first place, to say, those the cultures are so different, they're so peaceful, we're the terrible evil Westerns. If you study Indian warfare, give me a feed on that. Like there was probably a ferocity, something incredibly violent, probably in the deepest veins of those people, and also, of course, the Indo-European influence contributed to it, but it's utterly ferocious, right? And properly, also this idea of the individual that is sucked into this kind of almost, ever swallowing. Like India was always like this, right? And in the idea, it swallowed kind of every conqueror. At the end of the day, there was never like kind of a stability. It was always a huge effort to try it, but the system was too demographically and agriculturally enormous to be controlled, right, for the means of the time. So also the what was attempted by some of the enlightened Maoris, let's say more centralization, was normally countered by the Vedic, let's say, aristocracy in the countryside, to maintain this kind of more, if you want, chivalric idea, because fundamentally that's all what the Indo-Europeans injected in, also in the West, and the idea of policy of military, all the cultural identities revolving fundamentally around the religious military ideal. So also the elephant in itself was conceived imaginably as just a human smasher, because you could find all these throwaway peasants that Indian infantry don't have to be underestimated either, right? It's just that there were huge masses that, as far as we see also from the Mauryan tactics we made a video on, a military organization, I remember, were definitely subordinated to the aristocracy. So everything mounted from cavalry to properly horsemen, chariots, elephants, came before, right? And Indian warfare was based on this kind of idea of very aggressive, smashing, charging preeminence of the elite, of the aristocrats on the field. And that's often kind of overlooked, in fact. And ox hide and serpent skin also are kind of exotic, let's say, but they would surely work their own way. The elephant seems to have been sometimes painted with leaves and flowers. Some think that this may have not been common, but frankly, looking at the average of ancient warfare in itself, this was definitely a colorful spectacle. Everything was painted. Chariots were painted. Horses, as far as I know, I've never heard of this specifically, or even if I did, it's rare. The elephants, why not? Too. Also, the caparisons surely were all colored. There was properly that sense of need of religious meaning attached to everything that would make the same color with the same symbolism attached and so on an important character. It was kind of in line of principle, like kind of like heraldry in a way, like and customization, personalization, especially in such a you know disorderly mess as the whole subcontinent was in terms of different autonomies, allegiances, and so on. And in war, this was naturally important. Now, the elephant crew had essentially a driver and up to 3 warriors, as far as we understand. The driver could be armed as well, something that was kind of easier to happen, I presume, than, I don't know, a chariot driver, for example, that had something much more technical, I'd say something much faster to do, while on an elephant, it's mostly, especially there sitting in front of everybody, almost statically. At some point, you have really thinking of defending yourself. There wasn't much armor on average around, so even in here, probably missile warfare is underestimated as well. In fact, crews often had bows, as we will see now. There is a famous coin showing Porus and Alexander at the Battle of the Hydaspes, and we can see Porus at that point being actually on the elephant himself, and while usually, it would have been on the kings would have been on chariots, on horses. You know that Porus was the king, after all, of a small realm in the Punjab. So, but still, the forces that he could assemble were remarkable. So this gives you an idea of probably the size of India, and probably Alexander would have managed to conquer India had he prepared for, had he had the opportunity to launch a major scale expedition. It would have made actually a lot of sense, way more than trying to conquer things like, I don't know, Europe or something. But we'll talk about this another time. Well, what is interesting is that Porus is on the elephant. Also, in this coin, Porus' driver has a javelin. And Porus is alone, by the way, except for the driver on his mount. And other sculptures show solitary warriors as well, as we were saying before. When a second warrior appears, in art at least, he's often Parzol, or standard bearer, right? And it was naturally important to recognize, in fact, as we were saying before, through the comparison, through these standards, who was who there. But it's likely also that such bearers would be armored, right? Just as the drivers sensibly would have been. There is especially a lot of such evidence on the Sanchi Stupa, it's a beautiful piece of Indian art, with archer and standard being somewhat typical, right? However, there is a Western sources such as Megasthenes had to do with Indians for a while, mentioning Mauryan elephants with driver and 3 archers, right? And Scullard also reports a clay model of Mauryan date with 4 riders, which is possible. Consider that in this sense, elephants were, do not come like people just only in standard pack. Considering the enormous numbers, there would have been all a market revolving around, I don't know, selecting, purchasing, and also interbreeding. I don't know, animals of particularly large size, or even affected by gigantism or something like that, because that, of course, could provide with, neural damages aside, some much more imposing capacities on the field. It was, concretely, just think about cavalry. A lot in terms of cavalry versus cavalry has to do also with the size of the mounts, right? So the same would have been for elephants at the same time. And elephants can be, in fact, quite aggressive when they feel, they want to defend a group, or they get angry for some other reason. And in fact, you hear things from India every once in a while about an elephant killing somebody. But for that matter, in warfare that's much more evident and functionally evident, and in that sense the size of the elephant could afford more than 4 riders, right? In fact, Indian sources themselves mentioned such instances. For example, the Mahabharata once mentions 7 riders: 2 with hooks, 2 with bows, 2 with swords, 1 with spear and banner. Some scholars have rightly pointed out that this could be essentially a list including the escorting infantry together with the crew, which would make a lot of sense. However, we can't discard, as we were saying before, properly the amount of people who say on an elephant. At least we don't have a, the 4 number. The 3 even just seems to be the most common. It's just we don't know. But escorting infantry also was used and was a necessity, as we were saying before. One Buddhist source, for example, says that an elephant has 12 men, which an ancient commentator explains as 4 riders and 8 infantry, quote, 2 looking after each foot. That makes a lot of sense. The Buddhists were absolutely involved in the worst kind of bloodshed that, just look at Ashoka's reign that you can imagine. This all, don't ever let yourself be fooled by pacifism or in theory and practice. These are universes in which you can find everything, and generally speaking the ancient world was not really a tender-souled place. In any case, the weapons of escort infantry are basically and obviously the same ones you can find in the Indian armies in general, like bows, spears, javelins, axes, maces, clubs, swords, and so on. The important was defending the elephant, and how this happened was also partly left to whoever these people are, because we're generalizing about the whole Indian warfare, but let's say even just the ways these troops were recruited was not necessarily standardized at all, right? So was some degree of preference as well. Anyhow, the weapon most often used from elephant back was the bow. That the Indians. I made a video last year about the Indian archers, if I'm not wrong, or it was I don't know. But we were talking about. I made a playlist about Indian warfare, so if I'm not wrong, yes. But I will be expanding my playlists anyway. They had long bows, right? Bows were quite of a thing in Indian warfare, and this makes a lot of sense, especially at such short distance. The bow could inflict this devastating damage to whoever approached the elephant. And I don't know, testing, if you open YouTube, you search, replicas, testing, all the things, it would be interesting, but not so much, because I like elephants, and frankly I'm sad when they suffer and they die. I can't think of the bloodshed of of elephants in Indian warfare. In any case, testing like a long bow on an elephant, right, which would be interesting, because if these have an important degree of penetrativity, they may be actually a very effective anti-elephant thing. And in fact, that's generally the deal with elephants. They consider that they are also they're just like living towers. Like they elevate the archer from the ground, so they're an excellent platform to shoot from. Given that in battle, generally speaking, precision fire was not much of a thing, if not, in fact, in this closer distance, but when the sides closed in melee, but the like harassing, for example, an enemy position just by making elephants approaching at a safe distance, considering the elevation from the ground, would also increase the range of a normal longbow shot. In any case, javelins were also used, and these are good, in fact, at short range, because you can catalyze in there the strength short range, and also with some minimal gravitational increase for the height. And we know that javelins were usually, and remained importantly, as also anti-armor weapon in general, especially in the joints and so on. Porus himself fought with javelins at the Hydaspes. At this point, the Indian nobility, aristocracy, was surely very much trained individually in a warlike fashion. While the Mahabharata, in fact, says with one king showering both arrows and javelins on the enemy, right? And think it as very fast, right? And especially if it is chivalrically conceived like a 1 versus 1. This is the equivalent of the of the hero, right, arriving on the battlefield, hyper equipped on chariot, dismounting, making this tremendous show against the rival. And this is naturally heroic warfare, which per se never quite existed for real, but because they were always supported by other troops. But that was, in fact, the ideal. And so it was important for all these guys to know how to be dramatically skilled with all of these weapons. There are also shorter bows, perhaps of composite nature, interestingly enough, that had poured from the steppes. As you know, we were talking about it recently on the genesis of cavalry, literally, in history. So this was present in India as well. There are some interesting descriptions also. For example, Indian headgears. The one from Nearchus saying an upper garment which they throw partly over their shoulders and partly twisting falls around the head. Right. Then there is another very interesting weapon that was a bit enigmatic in nature, ascribed to elephant crews specifically. That is the tomara, right? And it's described as essentially as a javelin, right? Something that could be thrown. In fact, in the Mahabharata, the term appears called as a javelin, while in the Arthasastra it's defined as an arrow as well. And even here, I'm not sure of properly the etymology, so this is, in my opinion, just a case of approximation, if not mistranslation. It's like saying dart, right? If you say in Latin missilia, right, you don't quite understand. I mean, you have to study that context historically and archaeologically to say this is a general missile. You don't know whether it's a crossbow bolt. Right now, when I think about my medieval inquiries, or maybe just a javelin. In fact, what it seems, and it would make sense from the elephant, would be essentially, in fact, a long, let's say, a throwing lance of sword, a lance, or that perhaps longer than the average javelin, right? And that, in my opinion, this is just a complete speculation, might have been actually tied with a rope, right? The fact that, let's say, you are on an elephant, and therefore you don't have. Yes, there were actually. In other contexts also elephant towers and things like these, but in India, as far as we understand, we're mostly riding on the enemy, on the elephant's back. But the point is that you find yourself in a somewhat precarious situation, right? Consider elephants can run amok. There were ways to knock them out, and therefore, before they could run into your own ranks, and that meant literally you would have had collapsed together with all the elephant after you fixed essentially a something in his skull with a hammer. But the idea is that the least impeded by movements, the better it is, and the least you are equipped by, in theory, like for your own agility, the better it is. So I can't think of a sort of a harpoon, right? A sort of thing you can throw. Well, the harpoon properly hinges, so it's not properly, but it means something like a heavier javelin that could be thrown, but still tied to a spear that you can't, to a rope that you can retract the javelin through. Well, in this, if the enemy doesn't cut it, something like that in combat, you can can eventually throw that multiple times, and also because most of the hits will not actually get stuck particularly deep, presumably, into somebody, literally, and so you could recuperate that. If it is especially something different categorically from an average javelin and an arrow, this tells us, I think, in my opinion, that the javelin is in this sense mostly, the thing may be longer than a javelin, or somewhat more penetrative for some reason than a javelin. Maybe something more like a heavy javelin, which was quite common in the ancient world in general as a weapon, and the fact that it's, being misinterpreted maybe, or as a dart, or in general, it could be properly that indifference from another javelin. It could have to do with this. It could have to do with the idea of having essentially a weapon you can throw multiple times without having to be loaded with others, because where do you keep them, right? I know that on horseback, yes, everything was there. Skirmishers could bring normally lots of javelins, right, in hand, with one hand and the other throwing it, so it wouldn't be a dramatic problem. But still, right, especially if it's a heavier weapon, it could have been thrown in a different way, or otherwise, connected with a rope, or otherwise could have just been thrown and lost in that sense. But its specialty there might have escaped our. It was maybe a specifically anti-elephant weapon, or something maybe to hit some of the most armored opponents, or who knows. It just seems to fit in this kind of employment. In any case, yes, this is a bit what we know about elephants' appearance in the Indian warfare at the time, and we will talk more about elephant warfare, more broadly meant in the rest of the world, and their tactics employed, and how these units fit in the broader military organization. But for now, we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.